Alright, so let's take a look at some of the software and see how it works. So I'm going to look at version 7, and I'm just going to use the runnable jar file, which you can get from the code link over at GitLab. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to bring up two main windows. So this is what we call the display window, and this is the control window. The display window shows us the contents of the tubes within the system, and it's set out kind of like a oscilloscope tilted 90 degrees. So from left to right, we move in X from 0 to 40, and we're going to see a pattern of blue and red dots, or possibly purple, a mixture of those two, reflecting the concentration of chemicals within that tube. So let me run the system for just a moment. So the system begins initially with two randomly selected tubes containing chemicals, and this slider down here chooses how many bins have chemicals. So what you can see is that this tube over here, so this is 0, this is 40, these tubes go by 5. For each green line indicates 5 locations. So this tube had a little bit of chemical, and this tube had a little bit of chemical. And the color is purple, so it's a mix of red and blue. And time moves from the top to the bottom, so as the system runs, these lines will move down. And if things happened in other tubes, we would see those beginning to appear further down. When the trace gets to the bottom, it'll roll back up to the top, and it'll continue doing this for a fixed amount of time. This member number up here, member 0, tells us that this is the first initial system that's being simulated. After some period of time, this simulation will expire and we'll switch to member 1 and continue from there. So this system isn't going to do much because with just two tubes it looks like they're not interacting with each other. So we'll let that run. Here's member 1. Now member 1 looks a lot more interesting because you see how we started with two chemicals here and here. This one was all source. This one had a mix of source and destination, but their effects started to spread out to other nearby tubes. Now if I click on this display and I turn off the Update Live option, I can click anywhere and I can see a different view of what's inside these tubes. So I can expand this window. I can scroll wheel to increase the y-axis, and I can shift scroll to increase x. And we can see a little better what's going on here. You can also drag this window if you just want to look at some particular region. So if I click very close to the top, we see mostly just the two initial tubes here and here. And the red bar indicates the amount of source, or red, and the blue bar is the amount of destination, or blue. So this tube was mostly source with a little bit of destination. This was predominantly source with more destination. And if I click at a slightly lower spot, we see that some of the nearby tubes are beginning to have chemicals in them, and if we move down a little further, that effect becomes more pronounced, and by the time we get down into this region, suddenly we see a whole range of tubes with chemicals. Now the amount of chemical is lower, but the dispersion of the chemical is over a wider range. So again, I can shift scroll wheel, or sorry, just scroll wheel to blow this up and see better what's going on. And depending on where you click, you start to see different views of this. So it looks like most of the chemical is coming into the lower number of tubes and dropping off to the right. And if I'm interested in this, I can hit the loop button and say evolve, and this will continue to evolve. And if I hit the live update button, then it shows me the state of the system at each point in time as it's being simulated. So over here we see a little bit of change, and over here we can see some details. Now we can use this intensity slider to change the contrast, or the intensity, in this window over here. The lower this is, the more chemicals you need to see anything show up on the display, and the bigger it is, just a few chemicals will cause the display to saturate. But this gives you a much more detailed view. If for some reason you're interested in seeing the predominant shape of the blue, the destination, you can flip RB and see what's going on with destination, and then source is drawn on top. So this simulation will continue running because I've got the loop button set. In some versions you could hit expire and it would automatically stop looping. once it found something to be not interesting, but that doesn't quite work anymore in this current version. So it's just going to run through some generations now, and we can hit loop when it starts doing something perhaps interesting. So there's some unusual looking behavior kicking in, and we can zoom in on the window. And if we go into this window, we can scroll down and bring up, and this is a pretty typical pattern that we see sometimes. It's some sort of roughly bell-shaped curve, but the envelope slowly changes over time. And so we can begin to play with this, and we can do things like, for example, hit the stim button and introduce some chemicals into one randomly selected tube and see what happens. And in this case, it seemed to disturb the display, and then it slowly got absorbed, but now the shape of this display seems to be different. So we have the whole range from 0 to 40 over here, and everything seems to be sitting at the right. If we throw in some more chemicals, same thing happens. And so this is a potentially interesting system because it can take stimuli occurring elsewhere in the system and basically absorb it and cause all the chemicals to come up over here on the right. Alright, so that's a first look at the software and just some of the basic capabilities. A few other things to mention I'll do in the next video, talking about the set, the load and save, the initial bins, relative absolute, and a few other things like that. But that's a good starting point for using the software.